Good evening, students. So in the previous session, we were talking about, we started off with a new chapter called Human Health and Diseases. So pertaining to that, we started off with the basics of the human health as well as diseases, right? So we started off discussing what do we mean by health, right? So what is the importance of being healthy, right? And how do we remain healthy? So those are the things what we have discussed in the previous session. And along with that, we moved on into something with regards to diseases, right? So we saw what a disease is all about, right? So then we discussed what are the causes of disease, what could be the reason for a particular disease, and we also classified diseases based on their origin, right? So we saw the classification yesterday, and we started giving a few examples in each of the category what we have seen in the previous session, right? So we basically started dividing diseases into two major categories. One is called as the congenital disease, and the other one is called as the acquired disease, which is acquired during the lifetime of a person, right? Again, under that, we started talking about different types of congenital diseases, right? Different types of congenital disease, such as the genetic disorders, physiological disorders, developmental disorders, as well as the last one, transplacental disorders. Similarly, pertaining to this particular category, that is acquired diseases, we started classifying acquired diseases again into two major categories. One is infectious disease and the other one is non-infectious diseases, right? Again, under infectious disease, we saw two more categories, which is called as the contagious disease as well as the non-contagious diseases, right? So I gave you a couple of examples also, a few examples in each of the category, and we have discussed about all of those diseases also, right? So with regards to the introductory note on human health and disease, there is one more small topic which is actually left out. So today we'll take up with that small topic, and then we'll move on into the first part of the chapter, which is common diseases in case of human beings. So we'll be discussing about different diseases, right? So their causative organism, their mode of action, and what are the symptoms that are associated with each of this particular diseases, right? So without wasting much time, let us directly get into the small topic which is actually left out, which is called as pathogens, right? So let's begin with the term, let's begin with the topic called as pathogens. Right? So pathogens. So what do we mean by this term pathogen? Right? So what do we mean by this term called as pathogen? So any organism which is responsible for causing a particular disease is called as a pathogen. Right? So what do we mean by pathogen? Any organism, right? Any organism responsible for causing a disease. So any organism which causes a disease is called as a pathogen, right? Any organism which cause a particular disease is actually called as a pathogen. So there are wide variety of organisms, right? There are huge number of organisms which have the ability to cause disease in case of humans, right? So there are wide variety or huge number of organisms which have the ability to cause disease in the human. So all of those organisms which causes any sort of a disease in humans, we start calling it as a pathogen, right? So all of those organisms, it could belong to any of this particular classes, right? So all of those organisms which cause diseases would belong to either a virus group, right? It could belong to bacteria, right? It could belong to fungi, right? It could belong to a protozoa, or it could belong to a helminth, right? So all the organisms which have the ability to cause a particular disease would fall in one of these particular categories. So it could be either a virus causing disease, a virus which causes a disease. It could be either a bacteria, it could be either a fungi, it could be a protozoa, or it could be a helminth. So all of the disease causing organisms have been classified into one of these particular groups. If it is a virus, we usually call it as a viral disease, bacterial disease, a fungal disease, a protozoan disease, a helminthal disease. So when we take up with the first part of our chapter, which is the common diseases in case of humans, we'll be dealing with each of these categories, right? So we'll be taking up one or two examples from each of these 5 different categories, and we'll be talking about their mode of action as well as their symptoms that are associated with each of the diseases. All of those diseases what we'll be taking up are all said to be the common diseases which we would have completely heard of, right? So those diseases will be taken up in detail, right? Okay, so any organism which causes a particular disease is called as a pathogen. And as I've said, there are a number of organisms which cause diseases in case of humans, and all of those organisms falls into, it could be either a protozoan or they could belong to virus, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, or a elemental particle. Right now, how does these pathogens enter into the humans? Right. So entry of pathogen into the human beings, right? Entry of pathogen into the humans is through several points present on the surface of the human body, right? So how do these organisms or how do these pathogens enter into the body? It is through several entry points, right? Several points or several entry points which are located on the surface of the human body. Some of those entry points for these organisms to enter into the body is, it could be either mouth. So some of the organisms would enter into our body through the mouth, right? So some through the nose, right? So some through the eyes, right? Then some through the skin, right? Etc. So these are some of the entry points, right? Through which these organisms usually enter into our body. Now, once these organisms enter into our body, what do? Right? So once these pathogens, right, what we call it as these organisms, it could be either a virus, a bacteria, a fungi, a protozoan, or a helminth, whatever be the organism. Once this organism enters into our body, how does it enter? Either through the mouth, nose, eyes, and skin, etc. There are several other entry points also, how they enter into our body. Now, once these pathogens, once they enter into our body, they try to establish themselves within our body, right? So what is happening? Once they enter inside our body, they try to establish themselves inside our body. Now, why they need to establish themselves in our body? For three major reasons. One is for food, right? So one is for food. Second one for shelter, and the third one is for multiplication of their race, or rather continuation of their race, for the process of multiplication, right? So for these three processes, that is for food, right, for their shelter, as well as for the process of multiplication or continuation of their race, for these three processes, they try to establish themselves within the host organism. So who is the host? The organism which has infected into a particular individual or an organism, we start calling them as a host. So a pathogen and a host, that's the relationship what we have. Pathogen is an organism which causes diseases in a particular organism, which is called as a host, right? So once this pathogen enters into the host organism, now this pathogen will start trying to establish itself inside the host organism for food, shelter, as well as multiplication, right? For food, shelter, and multiplication. Now, during these three processes, that is, while it is acquiring food from the host, number one, while it is taking shelter inside the host, and number three, while it is undergoing the process of multiplication, what it starts doing to the host is, it would start bringing about some sort of damage to the host tissue, right? So it would start bringing damage. So during these processes, it would bring about some sort of damage. It would bring about some sort of damage to the host tissues, thereby leading to the development of a disease, right? So this is what is actually happening, right? So whenever these pathogens, whenever they enter into the human system, or whenever they enter into any organism, what we call it as a host, right? So whenever they enter into the host organism, they try to establish themselves within the host organism. They try to establish themselves for their food, number one, for their shelter, number two, and for the continuity of their race, for the process of multiplication. Now, during this process, what it does is, it starts bringing about some sort of damage to the host tissue, as a result of which it would lead to some sort of deviation in the physiological activities of the host, right? Bringing about some sort of disturbances in the homeostasis, thereby leading to the development of a disease, right? So if you could remember, we started defining disease. How did we define disease? Any sort of deviation from the normal functioning of the vital activities in the body of the host is called as a disease. So that deviation from deviation in physiological activities would bring about some sort of disturbances in the disturbances in what? Disturbances in homeostasis, right? That is disturbances in the equilibrium, disturbances in the balance of the body. So that disturbances, we started calling it as a disease. So that disturbance in equilibrium, we started calling it as a disease. Now, as these pathogens also, as they are getting food from the host, right? As they are getting shelter from the host, and as they are multiplying inside the host, they bring about this disturbances in the homeostasis by bringing about some sort of deviation in the physiological activities of the host, thereby leading to the development of a disease. Right? So that's how the host, that's how the pathogens usually work inside the host. Right? Now, this pathogen, right, is actually called, scientists have given it a name, right? So they have actually called this particular pathogens as an uninvited guest. Uninvited guest to the host. Right? So scientists have started calling the pathogens as what? As an uninvited guest to the host. Right? So because it is an uninvited guest, what is our body doing now? What is our body doing? It will start fighting against this particular uninvited guest because it is not invited. Right? Since it is not invited and it brings about some sort of disturbances in the homeostasis, our body will not stay quiet. Right? So what it will do, with the help of the immune system that is present in our body, our immune system will start fighting or defending against this particular uninvited guest so that we are protected from this sort of a diseases here. Right? So this is what we have, a small topic called as pathogen. Right? So once again, quickly going through this particular topic called as pathogen. So what do we mean by a pathogen? Any organism which has the ability, right? Any organism which have the ability to cause a particular disease is called as a pathogen. Right? So there are a huge number of organisms, right, which have the ability to cause a particular disease. So they all belong to either a virus, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, or a helminth. Right? So they all belong to these classes. Right? Now, how does this organism enter into our body? Through several entry points which are actually present on the surface of our body. So those entry points, it could be either the eyes, it could be the nose, it could be the mouth, it could be the skin, right? Any cut part also, right, would be some sort of entry point to this organism. Right? So through these points, the organism, once it enters into the host, what it does is it starts to or it tries to establish itself within the host. So why does it establish itself within the host? For food, shelter, as well as the process of multiplication. So during this processes or during these processes, what happens is it would bring about some sort of damage to the host tissue, thereby bringing about some sort of disturbances in the homeostasis, finally leading to the development of a disease. Right? So they are called it, they are actually referred to as uninvited guests. Now, since they are uninvited, our body will not stay quiet. So what does our body do? Our body will start defending against this uninvited guest or the pathogen. So with the help of our neuroendocrine system as well as the immune system, together they bringing about some sort of defense in our body, thereby protecting the host from any sort of diseases or infection. Yeah, right? So this is what we have with the topic called as pathogens. Right. Now, let's get into the first part of the chapter. So as I've already said, let's get in. We have divided the entire chapter into 4 parts, right? So the first one is the common diseases in case of humans. So that is the first part what we'll be taking up. So once we are done with that, we'll get into the next thing, which is called as the immune system. So that would be the second part of our chapter, the immune system, right? So we'll be getting into complete details of the immune system of our body, right? The fighting system in our body. Right? So we'll be talking about a lot of immune cells. What are their role? How do they fight against a particular pathogen, right? And how they protect our body. So that is the second part of our chapter, which is called as the immune system or immunity. The third part of our chapter is something related to cancer. As I've already said, we'll be talking about the basics of cancer, right? So starting from the beginning till the treatment part. So what are the treatment options that are available for cancer? All that we'll be taking up in the basics, just the basics, right? As I've already said, cancer is a very vague topic. right? Very huge topic, right? So studying everything in detail is not possible in the time what we have. So we'll just look up to the basics of cancer. So that would be sufficient for you at this point of time, right? Then the last part of our chapter would be something with regards to addictions. So we'll be talking about drug addiction, we'll be talking about tobacco addiction as well as the alcohol addiction. So those are the 4 different parts we have divided our chapter into, right? So in this session, let us begin with the first part of our chapter, which is the common diseases in case of humans, right? So we'll be taking up with common diseases in humans, right? So as I've already said, right? So there are a lot of organisms which are responsible for bringing about some sort of diseases in case of humans. And I also said that all of those organisms or pathogens which cause diseases have been classified, or they all belong to these 5 major groups. One, a virus. Second one, bacteria. Third one, fungi. Fourth one, protozoa. And the fifth one is element. Right? So we'll be taking up with each of these categories, right? So we'll be talking of 1 or 2 diseases with regards to viral diseases, virus, 1 or 2 diseases with regards to bacteria, 1 or 2 diseases with regards to element, protozoa, as well as fungi also, right? So we'll be talking about 3 major things. One is, what is the causative organism, right? So which organism causes this particular disease. Second one, we'll be talking about the mode of action, or rather the mode of infection of this organism. How does this organism transmit from person to person? That is the second thing what we'll be taking up. And third thing what we'll be taking up is with regards to the symptoms that are associated with each of the diseases, right? So let us quickly get into the first category what we'll be taking, right? The first category of disease what we'll be taking up, right, is the viral diseases, right? Viral diseases. So let's begin with the viral diseases, right? So talking about viral diseases, there are several viruses, right, which are responsible for causing several diseases in case of humans, right? N number of viruses are there which causes N number of viral diseases. There are so many viral diseases which have been identified by the doctors so far, doctors and scientists so far, of which some of the major viral disease what we have heard, right? What we have heard. So there is some list given in your book, so you can just go through it a little later, right? So there is some of the viruses which we have usually heard of, right? So some examples of our commonly heard viruses, right? First one, common cold. So whenever we talk about virus, the first thing that should come to our mind is common cold, one of the most common viral diseases. So we'll be taking up with this common cold in this particular topic. Any other examples what we can take for viral disease? We have hepatitis. Hepatitis is again a viral disease. Hepatitis B. I think you would have heard of hepatitis B, right? One more viral disease. We have HIV/AIDS, right? I hope all are familiar with HIV/AIDS. So HIV also will be taking up in detail in our later classes, right? Later on, we'll be talking about the structure of HIV virus and also the life cycle of HIV virus, the symptoms associated with that. All that we'll get into details in our later topics. Again, HIV/AIDS is again a viral related disease. Any other viral disease what we know, right? We have something called a smallpox virus, right? Smallpox, I hope you would have heard of smallpox also. At one point of time, it was so prevalent that it led to the death of so many people. But now, because of the vaccines that are actually available, we have been completely eradicated this smallpox virus, right? One more example, what we can take, polio virus. Polio also was actually very prominent. It multiplied so much in the olden days that right now none of us suffer from polio because of the vaccines that are actually available. Polio virus, we have measles, we have mumps. So all these are some of the common viral diseases which we have heard of, right? Even though we don't know much about it, we have at least heard of it, right? So in that perspective, viral diseases, we'll be taking up with one viral disease now, which is the most common type of viral disease. Recently, this disease also we can include under the viral disease, right? COVID-19, right? So COVID-19 pandemic also can be included under this particular thing, right? SARS virus, SARS disease also is another viral disease, right? So in this class or in this lecture, we'll be taking up with one of the most common viral disease, which is called as common cold, right? So let us take up with common cold. I hope all would have been familiar with this disease, common cold, right? Common cold. So the technical term, any idea what is the technical term that we usually give for common cold? Common cold is just a general name, what we usually call it, right? But there is a technical term, medical term, what we use for common cold. So that medical term for common cold, it is called as rhinitis, rhinitis, right? So medical term for common cold is rhinitis. It is called as rhinitis. Okay, now let's get into some details about this particular common cold. Right? Why do we call it as common cold? Why do we use the term common? Because it is so common. It is so common that it is affecting almost people who are present in almost all parts of the world. Right? Whichever part of the world you go, this virus affects that particular person. And what the scientists say till date is almost all of the human beings living today, at least once in their lifetime, they would have got this sort of a disease. Right? Is there anyone who hasn't suffered from cold till now? Right? No one. Absolutely no one. At least once in a lifetime, all of the human individuals would have suffered from this disease. That's the reason why they call it as common cold. Right? Now, this common cold is actually the infection which leads to the infection of, or it is a disease which leads to the infection of the upper respiratory tract, but it does not affect the lungs. Right? It is the disease of the upper respiratory tract. I hope all are familiar with the respiratory tract. It begins with our mouth and ends with the alveoli. Right? So we have different regions there. Right? So we have the buccal cavity, we have the nostrils, right? Not the buccal cavity. It begins with the nostrils or the nasal chamber. From there, it goes down, right? The larynx, the pharynx, the trachea, right? The bronchi, the bronchioles, right? Then you have the alveoli, all that, right? So that is the respiratory tract. So this disease is usually seen affecting the upper respiratory tract and not the lower respiratory tract. Because in the lower part of the respiratory tract only, we have the lungs, we have the alveoli, all that located in the lower respiratory tract. So what the doctors say is, this particular disease called common cold is actually a disease which usually affects only the upper respiratory tract and not the lungs, right? Only the upper respiratory tract. Now, what is the, let's get into the three things what we'll be talking about in each of the category. The first one, the pathogen. So what is the pathogen that is associated with this? So which virus causes this particular disease? So which is the pathogen associated with this? The pathogen here is called as rhinovirus. Right? It belongs to a class of virus called as rhinovirus. That's the reason why it is actually named as rhinitis, because it is caused by a virus by name rhinovirus. So this rhinovirus is the causative organism or the pathogen or the causative agent of this particular disease called as common cold. Right. Next, what is the mode of infection of this organism? Mode of infection. So what do we mean by mode of infection? How does this infection or this organism spread from person to person? We know that it is a contagious disease, right? So yesterday we saw what do we mean by a contagious disease. Any disease which is spread from a person to person through direct contact, we call it as contagious disease. So it falls under the category of infectious disease. Under infectious disease, it falls under the category of contagious disease. So what do we mean by contagious disease? It spreads from person to person through direct contact. So the mode of infection, how is this disease transmitted from person to person? There are two ways. One, we call it as droplet method, right? One is called droplet method, and the other one is called as the direct contact. So we'll see what is this droplet method. Other one is direct contact. So these are the two ways how this particular virus spreads from person to person. Number one, droplet method. What do we mean by this droplet method? So try to remember this, because several times we'll be using this term droplet method most frequently. So what do we mean by droplet method? Droplet method is nothing but it is the transmission or spread of the disease from person to person through tiny air droplets, right? Tiny air droplets, what we also call them as aerosols, very tiny droplets from a sick person, right? Like whenever a person who is suffering from this disease, that is common cold, whenever that person sneezes or whenever that person coughs, what happens? There are tiny droplets of air right, coming out of that particular person, either through the sneeze or through the cough, right? So these tiny droplets, right, when it goes on into the other person, when the other person starts inhaling these tiny droplets, that is the time where this organism, rhinovirus, would be transferred, right, or it would spread, or it would be transmitted from one person to other person. That sort of a transmission, we start calling it as a droplet method, right? So what do we mean by droplet method? It is nothing but transmission of the disease through tiny air or aerosol droplets from a sick person, from a infectious person. So whenever the person sneezes or whenever a person coughs, there are tiny air droplets which are being released into the air. And whenever a normal person inhales these droplets or aerosols containing this virus, it would get into the normal person also, bringing about some sort of infection. The same is the condition even with what we are facing now, COVID-19, right? The same condition, right? So the mode of transmission of COVID-19 is also droplet method. That's the reason why the doctors say, right? What do they say? Whenever you go out, always wear a mask so that you don't inhale those tiny droplets, so that you don't get affected by this sort of a virus. That is what we call it as droplet method. The second condition here is direct contact. So direct contact. The second way how this virus is being transmitted from person to person is through direct contact. Now, what do we mean by direct contact? It's obviously clear from the name itself, right? Direct contact. Whenever we touch certain objects which are touched by the infected person, or we can put it this way also. Whenever we touch certain objects which has this viral particles, like we can take it this way also. Whenever an infected person sneezes, and just imagine that there is a book next to that particular person. So as what did we say? Whenever a person sneezes, there are tiny air droplets along with the virus falling on that particular book. Now, with bare hands, when we touch the book, what is happening? The virus particle, which was present on the book, is now on our hands now. Whenever we take this hand and put it in our mouth or nose or eyes, those viral particles will start getting into the body. That's what we said, right? One of the entry points for virus is several points on our body surface, like the eyes, the nose, the skin, etc. So that we start calling it as the direct contact. So what happens in direct contact? By touching the contaminated objects, right? So whenever we touch any objects which are being contaminated by this virus, right, then there are chances of a normal person also getting infected from this virus. Same is the case even with COVID-19 also, right? So they say that whenever we touch any objects having this particular virus, and whenever we put our hands in our mouth, nose or eyes, there are chances that this coronavirus would start entering into our body. That's the reason why doctors are all repeatedly telling, always wash your hands, so that whatever virus is there even in our hands also would be completely gone, because of that solution what we actually use. And that's the reason why they say whenever you go out also, don't touch anything. Even though you touch anything, never put your hand on the face, right? Because if you touch anything, definitely some viral particles will be in your hand, and when you touch your face, automatically it goes to your eyes, the mouth, as well as the nose, right? So that is another way how even this common cold also is being transmitted from person to person. So two ways how the common cold or this rhinovirus is transmitted from person to person. Number one, droplet method, right? And number two, the direct contact, right? So this is what we have with the mode of infection of this organism, right? Next, the third category, talking about the symptoms, right? So talking about the symptoms that are associated with this virus, right? That is rhinovirus. I hope all are familiar with the symptoms, right? So you can tell me what are the symptoms, right? Because everyone would have experienced this cold, right? So we know what are the symptoms are seen associated with this cold, right? So let us quickly write down some of the symptoms here, right? With regards to common cold, the first one is, first and foremost is, there is nasal congestion. So what do we mean by nasal congestion? Blockage in the nasal cavity, right? Or blockage in the nasal chamber, right? So this blockage in the nasal chamber, we start calling it as the nasal congestion. Nasal congestion followed by nasal discharge. right? So nasal congestion as well as nasal discharge. One of the most common symptoms that is associated with this common cold. Along with this, what else do we have? What else are the symptoms associated with this? There is sore throat, right? Sore throat again followed by, right? What else? There is cough, then there is sneezing, sore throat, coughing, sneezing, right? Then person would suffer from headache, right? Then a person would have mild fever sometimes. Along with that, there could be some sort of body pains, right? Along with body pains, the person would also suffer with something called as fatigue. So what do we mean by fatigue? Fatigue is nothing but tiredness, right? A person would be exhausted, a person would be overtired, right? So along with that, we can take up one more also, watery eyes. Eyes would become reddish, it would become watery, right? So these are some of the symptoms that are actually associated with this common cold, right? So some of the symptoms associated with common cold, right? So it could be nasal congestion, nasal discharge, sore throat, cough, sneezing, headache, body pains, fatigue, as well as watery eyes, right? Some of the major symptoms that are associated with this. Now, what the doctors say is this particular disease called common cold is said to be very highly contagious during the first 2 to 3 days of infection, right? So during first 2 to 3 days of infection, it is said to be highly contagious. It can spread very fast. And also what the doctor says, there is no treatment for this disease. It usually subsidizes within a week, right? So within a week, it would become normal because of our immune system fighting against this particular virus. But till now, what the doctors say is there is no treatment available for this disease called as the common cold, right? But it usually subsidizes, it usually slows down, right, within a week or so, right? So this is what we have with the first disease in our list, first viral disease, which is called as the common cold, or it is also called as rhinitis, right? So quickly going through it once again, the positive organism of this particular disease is the rhinovirus, right? And mode of infection, as I've already said, mode of infection is droplet method as well as the direct contact. Now, what do we mean by droplet method? Right? So droplet method is nothing but it spreads through tiny air droplets or aerosols from a sick person whenever a person sneezes or whenever a person coughs, right? So that's the reason why don't be there or don't be next to a person who sneezes or coughs. Second method, it could be through direct contact whenever we touch any objects, right, which have this or which have been contaminated by this particular virus, right? Next, talking about the symptoms, right? Some of the common symptoms of this disease: nasal congestion, nasal discharge, right? Then followed by sore throat, cough, sneezing, headache, body pains, fatigue, that is tiredness, as well as watery eyes. So if you know any other symptoms, so you can just add up those symptoms also to this particular list, right? So this is what we have with the common diseases in case of humans. The first common disease, which is common cold, falling under the category of viral disease, which is also called as rhinitis. Clear this? Right? Now, let's move on into the next category, which is called bacterial diseases. Right? So, category number 2, what we'll be taking up is called the bacterial diseases. So, again, there are several bacteria, n number of bacteria which are present, which are known to infect the human individuals. Right? So, the second category here would be with regards to bacterial diseases. Right? So as I said, there are several bacteria, right? Both gram-positive as well as gram-negative bacteria also, which are responsible for causing some sort of diseases in case of humans. So some of the well-known bacterial disease, what we know, what we have heard of. Any idea? Typhoid is one bacterial disease, what we know, right? We have something called as dysentery, right? Another bacterial disease. Diphtheria, another bacterial disease. Tetanus, another bacterial disease, right? So like this, we have tuberculosis, another bacterial disease. I hope all are familiar with tuberculosis, right? You would have heard of leprosy, right? Leprosy is also another bacterial disease. There is another disease also called pneumonia, right? So some of the common diseases, what bacterial diseases, what we have heard of, right? So these are the list goes on like that, right? Just to name a few, I just told you a few of the common bacterial diseases, right? So among the list, we'll be taking up two diseases, right? We'll be studying about two diseases, their mode of infection as well as the symptoms associated with two diseases, of which the first disease what we'll be taking up is called the typhoid, right? So let's begin with the first disease, which is called as typhoid. I hope you would have heard of this particular disease called typhoid, right? If I'm not wrong, some of us also would have experienced this disease called as typhoid, right? So now let's get into a few things with regards to typhoid. So typhoid is usually seen affecting the small intestine of a person, right? It usually resides in the small intestine of a person and brings about some sort of infections in the small intestine. Later on, from the small intestine, it starts moving to different parts of the body through the blood, and it starts affecting different organs also. Right? So let's get into a few details with regards to typhoid. Now, as usual, the first one what we see is the pathogen. So what is the pathogen associated with this typhoid? So it is again something called as Salmonella typhi. Salmonella typhi is the bacterium which is associated with this disease. The causative organism of typhoid is Salmonella typhi. Right. Next, talking about the mode of infection. So how is this disease being infected? The mode of infection of this disease is through contaminated food and water. Contaminated food and water. So by taking in contaminated food and water, a person would start suffering from this disease called typhoid, right? Contaminated food and water, that is food and water having this particular organism called Salmonella typhi, right? So when we start consuming it, it would directly go into the small intestine and it would start growing there or multiplying there in the small intestine, bringing about a lot of infection to the small intestine as well, right? Now, what are the symptoms that are associated with this? Right, so symptoms associated with this particular disease called as Salmonella typhi. Right, so let's take up with the symptoms. The first and major symptom that is associated with Salmonella typhi is there is sustained high fever. Now, what do we mean by sustained high fever? Sustained is for a long period of time, right? So high fever, the body temperature would be very high for a few days, right? Continuously, right? So sustained high fever, one of the most common symptoms that is associated with this sort of a disease, right? Then, along with that, due to this high fever, the individual would suffer from weakness, right? The body would become weak and this individual would start suffering from this weakness. Along with that, there is abdominal pain. There is abdominal pain in this particular individual. Along with abdominal pain, other symptoms follows. There is constipation. Right? After constipation, there would be vomiting. The individual would start suffering from headache. And most importantly, right, there is one prominent symptom associated with this particular disease, which is called as intestinal perforations. So this is usually seen whenever the condition is said to be, or whenever the infection is very severe, it would lead to some sort of intestinal perforation. Now, what do we mean by perforations? Perforations are nothing but small pores or small holes in the intestine. So if the infection is very severe, these organisms would bring about some sort of small pores in the walls of the intestine. What we call it as intestinal perforation. And if the condition still becomes drastic or if it becomes still severe, it can even lead to the death of the person also. Right? So some of the major symptoms: sustained high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, constipation, vomiting, headache, as well as intestinal perforation in severe cases. If the condition becomes, or if the infection becomes more and more severe, it can also lead to the death of a person as well. Right? It can also lead to the death of a person. Right? So these are some of the common symptoms associated with this. Right? Now, how do we detect this sort of a disease? Right? So there is one blood test which is actually done to detect the disease, and that test is called as Vidal test. Vidal. Right? So this is a simple test blood test, which is called as the Widal test. So through this Widal test, the presence of this particular bacteria, that is Salmonella typhi, could be easily identified. Right? It is a simple antigen antibody test, just like how we do the blood grouping test. It is a very simple test, just like a blood grouping test. So with the help of this Widal test, we can identify whether a person is positive or negative for this particular disease called as typhoid. Right? For the treatment, there are several antibiotics available to treat this particular disease called as typhoid. Antibiotics such as ciprofloxacin, and there is another antibiotic also, one of a common antibiotic called as azithromycin, which is used to treat this sort of a disease called as the typhoid diseases. Right? So this is what we have with the second disease, which is called typhoid disease. Causative organism, Salmonella typhi. Mode of infection, contaminated food and water. So the food and water that is being contaminated by this particular organism called Salmonella typhi. Talking about symptoms, sustained high fever, weakness, abdominal pain, constipation, vomiting, headache, intestinal perforation, etc. And in severe condition, it would lead to the death of a person also. One more symptom also can be included here. It is loss of appetite. So what do we mean by loss of appetite? A person would not feel hungry, right? Loss of appetite, and in severe condition, it would lead to intestinal perforation. And if the condition is more severe, it could even lead to the death of a person as well, right? So how do we test this particular infection? With the help of a simple blood test, antigen antibody test, which is called as the Widal test. So through this Widal test, we can know or we can detect whether a person is positive or negative for this disease called as typhoid. So treatment purposes, there are a lot of antibiotics available. Antibiotics such as ciprofloxacin as well as azithromycin, commonly used antibiotics for this treatment of this particular disease called as typhoid. Right? So this is the first disease under bacterial disease what we have, which is called typhoid. Now before we move on into the next disease, whenever we talk about typhoid, there is a classical case of typhoid in medicine, right? Which we call it as regarding a particular lady, right? Whose name was Mary Mallon. Right, whose name was Mary Mallon. Her nickname was called as Typhoid Mary. So we'll just finish off with this, then we'll move on into the next one. Right. So this particular lady, what happened is Mary Mallon, right? So she was actually a cook by profession, right? She was actually a cook by profession. She was a native of Ireland. So from Ireland, she actually moved on to US, right? And started cooking in the house of several rich people. Right. So whenever she started cooking and whenever the people started eating her food, which was cooked by her, people suddenly started falling sick. Right. By the time the investigation was done, why these people fell sick, she would have moved to another place and started cooking in another place. Again, even in that place also, because of the food that she cooked, so people started eating it and people started falling sick. So like this, almost seven rich families who she cooked in US, every one of them fell sick and they were diagnosed to have typhoid. And among those seven families, there was one small girl also, and this small girl also died because of this severe infection of this disease, of this particular bacteria called as Salmonella typhi. Right. Now, the doctor started identifying what could be the reason. No one knew what could be the reason because this particular lady did not show any of the symptoms associated with typhoid. Then what the doctors identified was, even though she did not show any symptoms of typhoid, she was a carrier of this disease. Right? So since she was a carrier of this disease, whenever she started cooking, this particular bacteria from her started falling onto the food. And when people started eating those food, right, having this particular bacteria, that's what we said, right, contaminated food and water. So people started falling sick. So once the doctors and other people started identifying the reason, that they found out that she was the reason for this particular disease. So what they did, so they put her in quarantine, right? So they quarantined her for almost 3 years in a small island. So she did not know what was the reason she was quarantined, what was the reason why she was kept there in that particular island also, right? She could not understand the reason also. But later on, after 3 years, the doctors and other people there, they took a promise and left her. The promise was that she would never cook again. So only on this promise, they left her. But again, since cooking was her only source of income, she again started cooking. And after 5 years again, wherever she cooked, all the people started falling sick. right? So once people started falling sick, again people had doctors and other people identified that she is the sole reason for this, and again she was kept in a quarantine for almost 23 years where she passed away, right? So even though she did not show any of the symptoms of typhoid, she started passing on the disease from person to person because she was a carrier. That's the reason why they had nicknamed her as Typhoid Mary. Right? Her name is actually Mary Mellon, but she was nicknamed as Typhoid Mary because she was responsible for several people falling sick with this particular disease called as typhoid. Right? So that's what we have, a small thing with regards to Typhoid Mary, as well as the classic. This is actually considered as a classic case in medicine pertaining to typhoid. So whenever you study typhoid, you'll be told about this particular small scenario, right? So this is what we have with the first bacterial disease called as typhoid, right? So two diseases we have seen today. One is a viral disease, which was called as common cold. Second, bacterial disease, which is called as typhoid, right? So we'll stop here for today. In the next session, we'll take up with another bacterial disease, the second bacterial disease, which is called as pneumonia, right? So we'll take up with pneumonia in the next session.